Hi everybody, this is just a short little video over the behavioral perspective. For this video, our objectives and our agenda are going to be the same. So we're going to talk about the behavioral explanation, and then we're going to talk about some basic behavioral concepts. Before we get started, I wanted to briefly touch on the goals of science and behavior. So our goals, we have 3 of them. First, to understand behavior so that we can predict behavior and therefore can change behavior for the better. So when we talk about understanding behavior, we're talking about why behavior occurs. Take this girl, for instance, sleeping in class. I'm sure you guys have all seen this or been there yourselves. But first we want to understand why she's sleeping. So say she has a teacher who lectures for long periods of time, maybe using PowerPoint, turns the lights off. That might be a good understanding of why behavior is occurring. So she's getting bored and sleepy while the teacher is lecturing. So if we can understand that, then you can predict as a teacher that if you're going to stand up there and lecture for long periods of time and turn the lights off, then you're probably going to lose some of your students, or some of your students are going to fall asleep. And therefore, you can change that behavior. So you can turn the lights on, you can lecture for, maybe 15 minutes, have them get up, do an activity, lecture for another 15 minutes, things like that. So if we understand why, we can predict and we can change for the better. Our behavioral explanation of behavior. We ascribe to the fact that all behavior is learned. So the cause of behavior is in the environment. It's not due to any type of mental process or anything like that. It's due to the environment. Behavior must be observable and measurable. And then as a behaviorist, we focus on present environmental conditions. So if a behavior is occurring, we're going to look at what's going on in the environment before the behavior occurs, which is the antecedent, the actual behavior, and then what's going on in the environment after the behavior occurs, or the consequence of the behavior. And we're going to try to establish and verify functional relationships between behavior and the environment. And I like to think of functional relationships as if-then relationships. So if this happens, then this happens. So let's look at this a little bit further. Look at this comic from Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin has skinned his knee and he's crying and he's whining. So I asked you guys, why is Calvin crying? And most people will say, because he skinned his knee or because his knee hurts. But both the skinned knee and the pain are stimuli that precede the behavior to be explained. So we're trying to explain why he's crying and why he's whining. So is that really why he's crying and whining? And the answer is no. And to figure out the answer, we have to actually look at the consequences of the crying. If we have, say, a sympathetic teacher that's around, then crying will probably produce attention and sympathy. But now suppose Calvin's playing baseball with some boys that are bigger than him. The chances are that instead of sympathy, crying would actually probably be ignored, or maybe he might even get made fun of for crying. And so it's not going to take Calvin long in the presence of the big boys to take that skinned knee without crying. So his crying is actually controlled by the likelihood of a reinforcing consequence. So in the presence of the sympathetic teacher, he cries. In the presence of the bigger boys, he does not cry. Now, the situation, the sympathetic teacher versus the big boys, is important, but only because of its relationship to the kind of consequences his behavior brings in that situation. So if the action-consequence relation changes, so will the operant behavior. So let's say that this sympathetic teacher now decides that, she's baby Calvin a little bit, and he's starting to be a big boy, and she doesn't need to baby him so much anymore. So maybe he's too old to be crying. So crying in the presence of that teacher will probably stop soon, because she's probably not going to provide attention and sympathy anymore. So now in the presence of that teacher, he's not going to be crying. So basically, the situation is important, and only so far as it relates to the kind of consequences an action brings with it. Now let's look at this whole comic strip, because this is another point that I want to make with the behavioral perspective. If you look at this comic, so he skins his knee, he stops, he kind of looks around, he sees his mom, and he starts crying again. So crying is increasing in the presence of his mom. So we would say that his mom is a positive consequence. And if you're looking at this and you're looking at his mom's reaction, you're probably saying that does not look like a positive consequence. And you're right, it doesn't look that way. But how something looks is actually your opinion, and how it works determines the type of consequence it is. So we're always looking at the effects on behavior. It doesn't matter how the consequence looks. That doesn't look positive, but the behavior is increasing. So that's why we say it's a positive consequence. So keep that in mind. When we talk about positive consequences or negative or aversive consequences, it's not based on your opinion or how it looks. It's based on the effects of behavior. If behavior increases, it's a positive consequence. If behavior decreases, it's an aversive or a negative consequence. So keep all that in mind. Okay, when looking at these functional relationships, we're looking at those antecedents and those consequences, and we call this a three-term contingency, or the ABCs of behavior. So our antecedents are environmental events that happen right before the behavior occurred. What triggered the behavior? What sets the occasion for the behavior? And the consequences are what environmental events happen right after the behavior occurred. What did the person get out of the behavior? And this is where we find the function of the behavior, which we will talk about throughout the course. All right, guys, so now let's get into some basic behavioral principles. First, we have reinforcement. With reinforcement, we have a response that is reliably followed by a stimulus change. Either a stimulus is presented, which is positive, or an aversive stimulus is removed, which makes it negative. And with both of these, the response increases in the future. So, example of positive reinforcement, you have maybe a dog that barks at the table. He gets food, a stimulus gets presented, and therefore, in the future, he's more likely to bark at the table. With regards to schoolwork or the classroom, you might have a student who is on task, gets praise from the teacher, and her on-task behavior increases. With negative reinforcement, there's something aversive in effect. A response occurs, that aversive stimulus gets removed, and therefore the future probability of the response increases. So, example of negative reinforcement, you have a headache, you take aspirin, the aspirin removes the headache, so the aversive stimulus is removed, and therefore in the future you're more likely to take aspirin. In the classroom, a lot of times this is with regards to maybe threats from the teacher. So the teacher might threaten that if the class is not quiet, then they're going to get homework. And so the response occurs. So the class gets quiet, aversive stimulus is removed. So they don't get their extra homework, or they don't get their homework, and therefore the next time they come in the class, they're quiet because there's a threat that they might get extra homework. Examples. So that's an example of negative reinforcement. For both of these, regardless of if they're positive or negative, it's still reinforcement. So a response occurs, and the future probability of that response increases. Punishment is similar, but similar in the fact that a response is going to occur, and you have positive or negative punishment. With positive punishment, an aversive stimulus is presented. With negative punishment, there's something pleasant in effect, and that positive stimulus is removed, and the response is now going to decrease in the future. So reinforcement, response increases, punishment, response decreases. So let's see, positive punishment, an example would be maybe a student says something inappropriate during class. The stimulus presented might be a glare or the word no from the teacher, maybe a head shake, and the response decreases. So the child doesn't say the inappropriate response anymore. For negative punishment, something pleasant is in effect. Like I said, response occurs, the pleasant stimulus or positive stimulus gets removed, the response decreases. So just a basic example, you might have your cell phone. where maybe you say something inappropriate to your parents, they take your cell phone away, and you don't say anything else inappropriate to your parents anymore. In the classroom, you might be giving your students maybe 5 minutes of free time. If they start talking, the free time gets removed, and therefore their response of talking will decrease. All right, the other one that I want to talk about is extinction. So you're going to use extinction on a response that has been previously reinforced, either through positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. So just to recount, response occurs, a stimulus is presented or removed that makes it positive or negative, and then the future probability of the response is going to increase. With extinction, you're not going to be providing this reinforcing consequence. So your arrow is going to look like this. The response occurs, you're not providing the reinforcing consequence, either the pleasant stimulus, the positive stimulus, or the aversive stimulus, and therefore your response is going to start to decrease. Say you have a student who says something inappropriate to the teacher provides attention, and therefore the kid keeps saying inappropriate things. With extinction, the kid's going to say something inappropriate, the teacher's not going to provide that attention, and therefore the response is going to eventually decrease. There are some side effects of extinction, some advantages and disadvantages that we'll talk about throughout the course. Also, extinction is the process of actually applying extinction is different if you have either positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. So there are different types of procedures on how to actually implement extinction. Really briefly, antecedent control. We're going to talk about stimulus control in this class. You'll hear that term quite often throughout the course. And basically, when we go back and look at our three-term contingency, we have antecedent, behavior, and consequence. I'm going to just give you guys a little example. Say you have a teacher that says, get out your math books. The behavior, the kid throws a pencil, and the consequence is that the kid gets sent to the office. So this is our functional relationship. This is our three-term contingency. Basically, when we talk about stimulus control, we're talking about how likely it is that this antecedent sets the occasion or triggers the behavior. So if this antecedent has been present, has been in the environment in the presence of reinforcing the behavior, then this antecedent is going to gain stimulus control over the behavior, in that every time the teacher may say, get out your math books, the kid's going to throw his pencil, he gets to escape, he gets sent to the office. So we would say that the behavior is under stimulus control of the teacher's instructions, get out your math books. And it might even generalize to other instructions that the teacher gives. And it might end up being under stimulus control of any instruction provided by that teacher, and that the teacher provides an instruction, the kid throws his pencil, he gets sent to the office. So stimulus control is basically how likely it is that an antecedent is going to set the occasion or trigger the behavior to happen. We also take into account what we call setting events. And this actually makes, some people say that this makes the three-term contingency into a four-term contingency. So you might see that. Setting events are events that happen before the antecedent. So the antecedent is an environmental event that occurs right before the behavior occurs. But setting events don't really have that time limit. They can occur earlier that morning. They can occur right before the class period. They just occur sometime before the antecedent. And basically, they're going to make the antecedent more likely to trigger the behavior. And there are some different dimensions. So different researchers have suggested different ways to classify these setting events. Kazin has social, physiological, and environmental. Bailey has a couple more. And I actually provided you guys with a document in the module that gives you guys examples of social, physiological, and environmental setting events. But these are things like maybe the kid is really hungry, and therefore when he gets to math and the teacher says, get out the math books, he's more likely to throw his pencil and get sent to the office. So these are things like hunger, being sick, not feeling good, maybe getting into a fight with a friend or getting into an argument with a friend right before the student gets to class. It's things where if the kid maybe wasn't hungry and the teacher asked him to get out his math book, he might have gotten it out. But the fact that he's hungry, it makes it more likely that the antecedent will trigger the behavior. So that's what we talk about with regards to setting events. And then the last thing that I wanted to touch on is modeling and shaping. So these are really important behavioral concepts for teaching. So with modeling, you have to have a model. So this is a person, object, or action that provides an antecedent stimulus for imitation. Modeling is really, really important. Educators often talk about helping students to ask questions rather than just believing everything they see on TV or read on the internet. So when you conduct research to answer classroom questions, you actually model really good inquiry practice. So that's important. Demonstrating a procedure in class is a really good model for your students. I always say that you always want to lead, for example. Students are always learning. They're watching you. If you guys remember Bandura's studies with the Bobo doll, and I'm going to give you guys a really simplistic explanation of it. I'm only going to talk about 2 conditions. So he had kids in one condition come in and watch a video of an adult interacting with a Bobo doll. It's like a blow-up doll. And the adult was hitting the doll and punching it and calling it names. And then he had another condition where kids came in and watched the video of the adult being really nice to the Bobo doll. And then all the kids got a chance to interact with the Bobo doll. And this was done individually. And the way the kids interacted with the Bobo doll was the exact same as they watched the adult interact with the Bobo doll. So kids in the condition where they watched the adult be really aggressive with the Bobo doll, they were also aggressive. And kids that watched the adult be really nice and gentle with the Bobo doll were also nice and gentle with the Bobo doll. So apply that to your teaching. The way you act, you are oftentimes the model for your students. So if you want your kids to be on time, you be on time. If you want them to treat others with respect, you treat others with respect. So lead by example. This is really important. And other models in the classroom are peers, and you can also, the students can have their own behavior as modeling as well, which we'll talk about within the semester. The other concept is shaping. So if you have a kid, so shaping is basically you are reinforcing successive approximations to a target behavior. So if you have a kid that you want to sit, well, you want all your kids to sit in their desk the whole class period, and you have a kid that is just up and all around, well, you might have to use some shaping. So you might reinforce him being in his seat for, I don't know, 3 minutes. And once he's reliably doing that for 5 minutes, and then 10 minutes, and then 15 minutes, and then 20 minutes, and you just extend that time out till eventually you get to your target time, whatever that might be, 30 minutes, 35 minutes. And so we use shaping a lot as teachers, and so we will talk about that as well throughout the course. All right, guys, so we talked about some goals of science and behavior. We talked about behavioral perspective. We talked about that 3-term contingency, those functional relationships. When we have a pleasant or positive consequence or negative or aversive consequence, those are classified by the effects on the behavior, not because they look good or they look bad. And then our key concepts, we talked about reinforcement, punishment, extinction, and antecedent control, such as that stimulus control and those setting events and modeling and shaping. So, all right, guys, please let me know if you have any questions.